Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and there's a desperate need to get back to work, it seems. Governments are saying it. People who've lost their income are saying it. And yes, the coronavirus is probably saying it too. It wants more hosts to infect, and if we all start mingling, then it's payday for COVID-19. But the desperation is driven by money, which is an artificial construct. Are we all prepared to die for that? Or is there another way? And even if the economy does kick back in, what of all the debt that we've inherited in the process? With the Bank of England now predicting the worst slowdown in the UK economy for 300 years or more. Isn't now the time to seriously look at the idea of a debt jubilee? That's this time on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, I mean, we know that individuals, businesses and governments all going to come out of this virus with massive debts. In the US, maybe a few $1 trillion worth of extra government debt, which a lot of which is now being issued in 20 or 30-year bonds. So they don't have to pay it back for a long time. But we've got no talk of modern monetary theory. So these bonds are bonds which the government will have to pay off at some point, possibly after you and I have left the planet. And presumably that means that we know that interest rates are going to stay low as well now forever because there's so much government debt. I mean, that's pretty inevitable as well, isn't it, out of all of this?
Well, interest rates are low not because government debt is high, but because private debt is high. That's really the cause of where that's driven it down.
It helps the government too, of course, though.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, only in the sense that, this, again, as modern monetary theory emphasises, government money creation is an accounting operation between the central bank and the Treasury, which they foolishly let the financial sector intervene in the middle of as well. But the whole thing is ultimately payable by the Federal Reserve, by the relevant central bank. So
why this resistance to modern monetary theory then? Because I have heard from people who wouldn't have even entertained the idea, people in the banking sector who would have thought, it's the idea that governments can create money central banks can create money and give it to governments without any need to pay it back was just crazy talk. And now I hear them talking about it as a viable option. And yet we don't hear the Reserve Bank talking about it. We don't hear anyone in America seriously discussing it. And yet it seems like this is the ideal time to give it a try, at least.
Well, that's actually it's modern monetary theory. People say you don't have to give a try. What actually is the realistic description of how accounting operates. But the thing which is happening in England, which makes it so interesting and so much affirmation of the modern monetary theory approach, is that the central bank the Bank of England is directly buying for treasuries directly from the Treasury itself. It's buying those bonds. And
rather than buying it on the second. Just on what difference does it make whether they buy it directly or they buy it through the secondary market? Whether the government issues those bonds, someone buys it, but then the central banks we're going to.
Largely, it means the financial sector doesn't earn income out of it, and that's one reason why I think when we want to know why there's so much resistance to it most of the times, because if you take it seriously, it's by a large part of the financial sector because they don't get the income out of the bonds. So if you think, let's imagine you've got bonds paying 10%, which of course is far more than is paying right now, and you offer £1 billion, which is far less than the amount of money we're talking about. Say £10 billion, just to round it all out. So if the Treasury issues £10 billion worth of bonds yielding 10%, and they sell those, then the financial sector buys those bonds, then the financial sector has claimed an asset which is going to give it a £1 billion a year income stream. Now, how is that actually paid? Well, the bonds are still managed by the central bank. And I might be wrong in part of the detail, but I think I'm generally correct. When those bonds are sold to the financial sector, the interest payments are directed. The Treasury directs the interest payments to be paid to the financial sector, effectively through the Bank of England. And what's happening? You're cutting that out. So rather than the money being paid to the financial sector, if you sell that instead, sell that £10 billion worth of bonds is sold by the Treasury director of the Bank of England. The Bank of England says, okay, we'll buy those £10 billion worth off you of bonds. So they record a £10 billion asset on the asset side of their books. And the £10 billion pound liability they create is £10 billion they pay into the Treasury's account, and the Treasury can then spend that £10 billion into the British economy. Now, the Treasury is then liable to pay £1 billion a year to the central bank for the interest. And how does it do that? Well, it pays it all right, and then the central bank returns the profit from the £1 billion a year, leaving out the costs that are involved, the cost of managing the Bank of England itself, which is nowhere near the scale of the interest payments involved. They remit the profits they make from that back to their owner. And who's their owner? Oh, it's the Treasury.
Yeah.
Quite literally. I mean, that same thing applies in Australia. The Reserve Bank makes a large profit out of some of its foreign exchange operations and also out of its bonds. Its profit is remitted to the Australian Treasury every year. So in that sense, it's all an eternal operation by the government sector.
Right. So, but when the Bank of England says, well, okay, we're going to cut out the middleman, we're not going to go through the finance sector, we're just going to issue these. So the government's going to issue the bonds and we're just going to buy them. The Treasury's going to issue the bonds and we're just going to buy them. I suspect they're doing that for liquidity reasons, aren't they? Because they had all these concerns about liquidity in the finance sector. But at the end of the day, they still are expecting that those bonds are going to be taken off their balance sheet at some point, even if it's in 30 years' time. So, and that's the only difference, in effect, from what's happening now and modern monetary theory. And it's like saying, well, okay, we won't go down the modern monetary theory road. We'll just push the problem 30 years down the track. I mean, it seems like a small step to take, doesn't it? To just say, oh, sod it, let's just try modern monetary theory and put it into practice.
Well, and not so much put into practice as simplified, because it's already putting into practice as describing the actual accounting operations involved. What you're doing is leaving out the financial sector. They're not being paid any money for it. And they're likely to complain and say how disastrous it's going to be for the economy, and you have to pay this debt level back, et cetera, which is all the sort of stuff we heard from them from the financial crisis that we're hearing from them again right now. There's actually an interesting analogy to the world of Jane Austen, because if you go back to the days when being a wealthy person in Britain meant either having land or large amounts of government bonds. The money that was paid to keep the Austens alive came out of their purchases, not the Austens, but some of the men that they were competing.
People which they wrote about.
That was coming out of the Central Treasury, effectively financing the ruling class of Britain in return for them purchasing the bonds. And it's a similar thing that's around to the financial sector. So they have a vested interest in saying, you've got to sell the bonds to us. You shouldn't sell it. You shouldn't just do what is actually possible by the sheer mechanism of accounting. You shouldn't let the Bank of England buy the bonds off the Treasury directly. But in fact, the only thing which changes is who gets the income from the bonds themselves. And at the moment, that income goes to the financial sector. If the Bank of England buys them directly, that income effectively goes from the central bank back to the Treasury again and stays in. So there's no need to finance it. There is no need to. So,
okay, and it just makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because the finance sector, even without that issuance of extra bonds, I mean, there's still so many bonds swishing around, and in the United States, they're not following that approach. They've got $2 or $3 trillion with the interest for which is going to find itself in the finance sector. But then you've also got all this extra debt which is being racked up, private debt which is being racked up as well. So the finance sector is going to come out of this much bigger than it went in, isn't it?
Well, potentially no.
If we're not careful.
A lot of that debt's going to be unable to be repaid, and this is the real danger. I mean, Michael Hudson's been saying for a hell of a long time that debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. But what's tended to happen is what Yanis Varoufakis what did he call it? His wonderful expression for it, effectively kicking the can down the road with private debt. You pretend that you can roll over debts that can't be repaid, so you reissue them. I think he calls it extend and pretend. And so you have a country which, when Greece owes debt to the European Union, that is not like typical government debt. That's because they don't have their own currency. But you simply pretend they can pay the debt. You capitalise the interest they haven't yet paid, and you create an even larger debt burden further ahead. With the private sector, that's not likely to happen. So if you have a private organisation which can't service its debts and the bank the bank that it owes the money to has to write the debt off and they first of all put it into its bad debt folder and then finally write that debt off. That company will fold. The bank won't go and try to rescue them by getting them yet another loan because they know they can't finance it back in the first place. So the odds are there'll be a large chain reaction of bankruptcies. And the real danger here is that those bankruptcies will take down not just the companies, but the banks themselves.
Yeah. But not now, a year or 2 years or 3 years down the road. And the governments are kicking the can down the road, aren't they? Because in the UK, we've got the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme. You can get finance up to £5 million for up to 6 years. The government is going to pay the interest charges for the first 12 months. Beyond that, you're on your own. You're still going to have to put your house up or whatever as a personal guarantee. And it's similar in the US. They've got the Main Street lending program, which basically defers payments for the first year, but it must all be paid back in 4 years at the LIBOR rate plus 3%.
Oh, my God.
And this is crazy stuff, isn't it? Because it's like going, so long as, for the first year you're okay, but just hang on for 2022.
And then we're going to smash you in the face with the extra debt you've run out during a period when you should have prepared for a virus in the ways that we didn't. It is quite scary because it does mean that there'll be a large-scale level of bankruptcies coming out of this, and the financial sector will be in a crisis after we get through the coronavirus crisis. So,
businesses are being fairly smart. There's only I'm reading there's only 1,000 businesses have been granted loans under that scheme in the UK out of 6 million small businesses.
That's wide enough not to take it on. Yeah.
$145 million is the amount of loans so far, which is just a drop in the ocean, isn't it? But what has been done in the UK is this idea, and I think this is going to come back to bite people as well, the furloughed workers scheme. So rather than the US approach, which has seen unemployment rise about 20 million, by an extra 20 million people or so far, in the UK, we've got 800,000 companies of furloughed workers, so 6.3 million people in total, with the government paying 80% of an average salary. So this is getting close to a quarter of the workforce, and it could actually be more because the British Chamber of Commerce surveyed firms and found 70% of private firms plan to furlough workers. So is this a good idea or not? I guess it's good, but what happens when you wind it back? If, are we going to find, my fear is that we're going to find that, a lot of circumstantial evidence I know through friends, people who've been furloughed, but the job just isn't sustainable. So rather than giving them the sack now, knowing that job's not going to be around, they've kept them on because the government's going to pay their salary for a little while. But at the end of it all, the company just can't sustain that level of employment. We're going to find that massive spike in unemployment happening after it. Yeah,
that's the real danger. That is that we're going to go out of
kicking the can down the road again.
Yeah, again, we're sustaining ourselves to some extent. I mean, we should be paying 100%, not 80%, but we're sustaining, but running up, some financial commitments that have to be met at a future date. And when those financial commitments are met at a future date, the economy falls over again. So, and particularly if the governments go for austerity once more, which of course is unnecessary, but almost inevitable to happen given the mindset of people making the economic decisions. So it's, this is just the very beginning of the whole process is the actual coronavirus itself.
Well, it's not. I mean, supposedly. I mean, Boris Johnson has said no, we're not going to return to austerity. But then he's going to be faced with the rest of his government pointing to the fact that they have racked up so much debt and how they're going to pay for it. And obviously, the old style thinking says, well, it must be paid back. But it's even aside from that, businesses are not going to be investing, are they? The Federal Reserve produced a report this week. They pretty smart. They used basically a machine to sift through the earnings calls of 600 companies last month. And they've concluded 42% are saying that they are going to trash investments. That's basically this year. So there's going to be no extra investment by companies. I mean, the economy at best is going to stagnate, isn't it? I mean, we know we're going to get into a hefty recession, but we're not going to invest our way out of it, clearly, either by governments or by individual companies.
Yeah, and that, like, if you're talking about 40% of firms saying they're not going to be investing, and you got that being investment being about roughly 30% of GDP, that itself is a serious recession. So, and the households themselves aren't going to be spending as much. So, it is it is a scary prospect for the future. And if we bring conventional economic behaviour on top of that, as you say, by bringing in austerity and so on, it'll only make it worse. So it's an awfully chaotic period to be foreseeing for the global economy. With, of course, we're still very much in the middle of the woods when it comes to the virus itself right now.
Yeah, we are. Who knows how it's going to go on for? Now, I do want to get on to your idea of a debt jubilee because its time has come, perhaps. Yeah. But perhaps one point just in support of it. We are going to see a massive divide, aren't we, at the end of all of this? So I'm okay. I'm working pretty much as I was before, but I've got friends who are sitting at home twiddling their thumbs, wondering how they're going to pay their mortgage. And then we've got companies that are going to do very well out of this. Companies that are distributing food, for example. We're still eating at the same rate. But other industries like tourism, airlines, obviously completely trashed. So we've got people who kept their jobs and those who haven't. We've got small businesses that are sailing through this and those that might make it through but incurring massive debts and might fall over anyway. From an economic policy perspective, how do you manage all of that? Because I know that there's this big fear of giving money to everybody. It's got to go to people who deserve it the most. I think deserve was the word that was used by the UK Chancellor. I mean, it's how can you tell who's doing well and who's not? Because there's going to be enormous diversity coming out of this.
Yeah, because there will be industries which never recover again. I think the airline industry is clearly going to be one of those. Tourism in general, companies like Airbnb being banned in Australia right now, aren't they? I think that was the case.
Are they? Well, it makes sense. Well, they don't want anyone to come in, anyone to move around. So the business is, effed anyway.
Which means the people who are relying upon them to pay their rental, pay their mortgages for their investment properties, they're gone. So there's a horrific level of damage coming out of this, and it will be all over the place. And that's one reason why I argued, look, you don't even try to decide who's deserving and who's not. Simply replace the cash flow we're losing from the impact of the coronavirus for as long as it's necessary, and try to make it that people's current financial commitments can be met, even if they're financial commitments that I think should be ultimately abolished, such as the level of mortgage payments people are making right now. While we're going through this, don't upset the apple cart any more than the coronavirus itself has already done. But in fact, we're disturbing it already by giving people 80%, by trying to decide who's deserving and who's not right now, by therefore slowing down the rate at which money actually gets out into the public. That's particularly the case in America, it seems. And then you come out the other side and there'll be industries which has been completely destroyed. And of course, the tourism and the airline being the most obvious cases. And what the hell can you do? You can't say it's all your fault. You didn't plan for the coronavirus because, excuse me, you're the government sector. What planning did you do? The answer is bugger all. So we simply have to say, let's just minimize the damage of this thing rather than amplifying it. And unfortunately, I think we're going to amplify it.
Yeah, well, we came out of 2008, didn't we? We saw massive deleveraging after the global financial crisis because people felt exposed, so they stopped spending as much and tried to get their debts down. It's the opposite is happening now. People are racking up debt because they have to, so they can't afford to spend. So it's the same story, isn't it? In that, spending doesn't happen. It's related to debt. It's possibly going to go on for decades. But people have got no choice on this. They're not deleveraging. It's going the other way at the moment. And, and then maybe the deleveraging happens later. We're talking about, possibly the rest of our lives, the repercussions of this, aren't we?
However long that might be. Yes, I think.
Yeah. Even for our younger listeners.
I think that is the real danger. That this, we're laying. And this is the reason it's so damaging, because the people in authority don't realise we have a private debt problem. And this is what's been so frustrating to myself, Michael Hudson, Anne Pettifor, Richard Vague, Richard Werner. We all know there's a private debt problem. And yet the people in authority don't realise there is one. And yet, therefore, they're not even aware that they're adding to that problem by allowing that debt to accumulate even more rapidly during the period of the coronavirus. And then if they insist on those commitments being met on the other side, there will be an incredibly fast downturn in the economy because credit will already have disappeared. The government will be doing what it can to partially replace that demand through things like that 80% scheme in the UK while the virus is in place. When they pull it out of the way, we'll have negative credit rather than positive credit effects, and suddenly the government stimulus is completely withdrawn. Then we'll fall over very rapidly indeed. And then they say, where the hell did that come from? Well, it came from what you didn't treat properly 12 years ago with the financial crisis, whose causes you ignored back then, whose symptoms you're ignoring now. So
right. But it will be so evident this time, won't it? I mean, everyone's going to go and look. Well, look, there's so much private debt now, so much private debt that people can't afford to survive. They're going to go hungry. So, I mean, you've always said, that when we're talking about the debt jubilee, the idea of a debt jubilee, it's not going to be accepted. It's going to take some sort of exogenous shock. Well, here it is, and it's going to be so evident, isn't it, in the next few months?
I think that's the case, and that's again what when I first put that proposal forward, it was back in I think about 2010 from memory, and I wrote it up in a detailed sense in 2012, and I haven't touched it since because I thought, what's the point of developing an idea which is never going to have a chance in hell of becoming a policy anyway? I didn't anticipate ending up in hell so rapidly because of it, because my original argument was, well, we'll deal with the private debt overhang the same way we dealt with it back in the 1930s, and that's by going to war. And in the situation of a war economy, this time a war to try to recover the damage we've done to the climate rather than a war against the Nazis, of course. But in that war, as a side effect of all the cash we'll generate from the government side, will enable the private sector to pay its debt down. And if we survive the climate crisis, then we'll come out the other side with a revived economy as well. But now this coronavirus is so much faster as a crisis than I was anticipating with climate change, that we'll have the crisis. If we get out of the coronavirus problem itself, we'll have the financial crisis, instantly, and it'll be worse than it was in 2008 and more sudden. And it'll be before the rest of the climate thing starts to strike. We won't be paying the debt down by the spending we're doing from the government sector to reduce the damage from climate change. So yes, it is something which I think its time has well and truly come, and it's about time I sat down and spelled it out in more detail yet again.
Yeah, I think so. And we can talk about it more on the podcast. But just for definitions of a debt jubilee. So we hear, people are talking about the idea again in all circles now about the idea of helicopter money. Sometimes it's misinterpreted. So, for example, the fact the US has paid $1,200 into people's bank accounts is being referred to as helicopter money, but it's not. It's still government debt, isn't it? That it's still being through the issuance of bonds, which are still expected to eventually be paid for by the government. But if you didn't go through that and you just said helicopter money, which is money created by the central bank, paid into people's bank accounts, what is the difference between that and your definition of a debt jubilee? Or is it the same thing in effect?
It's fairly similar, because again, when you look at the capacity of the government to service any level of debt it creates, then it could finance a debt jubilee for the private sector by running up its own debt and having an increase in public debt as a result of that. But the easiest way to go about it, and again, this is thinking in terms of the balance sheet of the central bank in terms of assets, liabilities and equity. First of all, the central bank is the only bank that doesn't have to maintain positive equity. I've actually got that on record from a number of researchers I know in the Bank of England, including David Bolat. And it's BHOLAT for those who'd like to search out the paper. But it said central banks can and do operate with negative equity. So they can actually get away with it and not have to worry about the impact of creating assets, not creating a matching level of equity for them as well. But it's one way you could do it, and this is actually taking a leaf out of the Bank of England again. The Bank of England lets the Scottish banks create Scottish pounds using what's called a Titan as an asset on their own bank balance. So I don't know how much has been created in the way. Have you ever had a Scottish dollar in your bank account? I'm sure you have.
A Scottish pound. I think it's called pound. Yeah,
yeah.
Well, you go up to Scotland and you pretty quickly find your wallet is full of stuff full of Scottish pounds.
That's right, which you can use back in as long as you don't have totally sceptical shopkeepers in London, you can spend them back in London.
In theory,
they're accepted throughout the whole of the UK. But let's say there's £1 billion worth of those Scottish pounds in circulation. Then what they're balanced by is an asset. That's a liability for the Bank of England. The way they're balanced as an asset for the Bank of England is an asset that they call Titans. And a Titan is a £100 million note. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you'd like to go shopping with that at Harrods, I can see. However, if you took it out of the Bank of England, first of all, you'd be probably arrested. And secondly, nobody would accept it as legal tender anyway, even though that's what it says it is. It's simply a piece of paper. I don't know whether they produce them on a photocopier. I imagine they do. But that's their face value. So that £1 billion worth of actual notes in circulation is balanced by 10 of these Titans at the Bank of England. So the same thing could be done to create the money for a modern debt jubilee. They could simply say, we are creating, let's say, £1 trillion, if we actually wanted to push the debt level down as far as they think it should be pushed for the UK, £1 trillion worth of Titans, and with that £1 trillion, we're going to put on a per capita basis £1 trillion in the bank accounts of the people of England, people of the UK.
No. So the idea is then they'd use that to pay off their debts or to make it through this difficult time. How are banks going to make their money through this? Because banks are going to collapse in this, aren't they? Because because banks have got to be too big, and one of the reasons banks are too big is because the government sector. Even though we live in a fiat money economy, the government has been actively curtailing its capacity to create fiat money. So why do people turn? They turn to the private sector. And we've had this enormous growth in the level of private debt, particularly in the UK. The UK is probably my favourite example of a debt bubble caused by neoliberalism, private debt bubble. Because when Maggie Thatcher came to power in 1979, the level of private debt in the UK was roughly 60% of GDP, and there's data from the Bank of England going back to 1880 showing for that entire century before Maggie's ascension, the level of private debt in the UK never exceeded 73% of GDP. Now, 2 or 3 years after Maggie gets in power, there was the deregulation of the mortgage market, the whole thing about, letting you buy your own council flat and stuff like that was a major part of it. The private debt level then rose from 55% of GDP, which it was in 1982, to 193% of GDP. Right, because commercial banks were basically creating that money to extend to loans. Yeah.
Now, what I want to say, that's far too much. You should never have gone beyond the 75% of GDP maximum that you had for the previous century, when, so far as I remember, in looking at the data, British capitalism wasn't doing too badly. Get back to that 75%. That means about 100% of GDP of money which has been created by the banking sector as credit money has to be replaced with fiat money. So the whole idea is a replacement of credit money with fiat money.
But can you beat the system, Steve? So say I find I've got, I don't know, what are we talking about, 5,000? What sort of magnitude are we talking about here? That everyone gets what, £5,000, £10,000?
Yeah,
put into
more than
their
that.
bank?
You're talking what a population of let's say 50 million income earners. Then you're talking 200. If you want to go pump out $1 trillion. That's £20,000 a head. I think it was £20,000. Yeah, I think so.
Well, that sort of magnitude, okay, not all at once, presumably. But do you know what? If I had £20,000 right now, I would just pay £20,000 off my mortgage, and then perhaps I'd borrow. I'd say, well, this is great. I can leverage more to borrow more now.
And I would say no, because that's not the end of the whole proposal. Because the whole thing is saying we let too much credit money be created last time round. We have to find a way of stopping that happening in the future. So we have to know how irresponsible the banking sector is and stop it from creating that amount of debt again in the future. And one of those ideas is what I call the pill, which used to be, I wonder how much my audience actually understands the reference to the pill these days. I've got a feeling a very small percentage. But back when you and I were young men, the pill was a serious issue. And anyone who
went out for a night out with Boris Johnson probably knows, or maybe doesn't. Maybe that's the problem.
Maybe anyway, it doesn't. The number of kids he's had, maybe they don't. Okay, but the PIL stands for Property Income Limited Leverage, and this is saying that the whole idea that banks lend based on the income you have is a fiction. They have a totally rubbery approach to the amount of income you earn, and we've seen that from all the liar loans and stuff that banks have indulged in around the globe for the last 30 years. Instead, put a ceiling on the maximum amount of money that can be lent to buy an asset, which is based upon the income earning capacity of that asset. So in the case of housing, one simple metric I've used is to say that the maximum amount of money should be allowed to borrow to buy a house, whether you're me or Rupert Murdoch, the maximum amount of money should be 10 times the annual rental income of the property. So taking the place that I used to rent in Waterloo, which I rented for I think I paid £1,500 a month, so I was paying £18,000 a year. That would mean that the maximum anybody could borrow from a bank to buy that property would be £180,000. Now, that would mean most likely that there'd be a halving at the price level of those houses over time, maybe fairly rapidly. But what it also would mean is that if that was the rule, and you would actually see when you went to buy a property, here's the maximum amount of a loan you can get, period. And the only question would be, who do you get the loan from? Then you would have a negative relationship between leverage and house prices, whereas at the moment you have a positive relationship. What actually causes house prices to rise is an increase in the level of new mortgage loans. And so, we as individuals, we have an encouragement for that, because if you and I are competing over the same property, and let's assume we have the same income, then at the moment, the one of us who wins is the one who gets the larger bank loan. But if you had its limit, we couldn't, the income, that would be taken out of the equation. And the only way we can compete with each other would be by saving more money. So you'd get a negative, if I want to get a negative feedback, as they call it, what do I call a dampening feedback between leverage and house prices.
Which all makes perfect sense. But through all of this, you are saying to the finance sector, hey, we're going to put whatever the figure might be, 20, 30, 50,000 pounds into everyone's bank account. And you're not going to clip the ticket on that. More to the point, it's going to be used to pay off debt. That means you're going to lose the ticket that you've been clicking on that 50,000 in debt if that debt is repaid. And then in the future, we're going to limit the ability for asset speculation, which is pushing prices up, which is how you're making your money. That's a triple whammy for the finance sector there. How much smaller are you expecting the finance sector would be at the end of all of that?
In the UK's case, it's said to be about 1/3 to 1/4 its current size.
It would lose 3/4.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to. I mean,
so they're going to put up a fight against that, aren't they? Obviously.
Oh, you bet your bottom dollar they're going to put up a fight against it. The only thing that's going to make them potentially support it is a possibility of the alternative being going bankrupt, which is the other side of things for the coronavirus, because if you have the impact that I expect the coronavirus to have on financial solvency on the other side of the crisis itself, then lots of those banks who are highly geared are going to find the percentage of the loan book that has to go bad will go bad, and bang, the bank's going to be bankrupt. And
right. Unless governments keep on kicking the can down the road. So they're saying, well, okay, we're going to pay the first year of loans. You get to the end of the year and it looks like it's all going to fall over. Then they go, we'll do another emergency plan. We'll do it for another year or another 3 years or whatever. And lots of can kicking, which is going to supposedly be propping up those loans to keep small businesses alive. But really it's helping the finance sector maintain its clip of those tickets.
And that's what worries me. I think that's what's going to happen. So even though I'm more optimistic about a debt jubilee being a possibility now, I still think that the political power of the financial sector is so great they'll manage to distort it and manage to prevent it. And then it'll be in the aftermath to the impact of avoiding a debt jubilee that we actually start getting closer to actually having one. Because if you avoid it and you then have financial corporations falling over because the debt that they've issued is too high for the people to be able to service in the post-coronavirus economy, then a lot of them are going to go bankrupt. And there's no way to get around this except for the confrontation with the finance sector. I can't see it being avoided.
And yet we need the money. We need people with money to be able to invest, because we will see a big shift, a big structural shift happening in the economy. So it's very sad to see airlines go to the wall, for example. But it would be better if they were replaced by something that is perhaps more ecologically friendly, which is part of the future. So, I mean, we're going to see a structural shift. But we won't see that structural shift if there's not the money there to invest to see other businesses grow.
Yeah, and well, it's also a question of whether we realise we have to go backwards in terms of our pressure on the planet as well. But in that sense, I see coronavirus as a relatively friendly shot across the bows by the environment to our economy. Because one of the scariest prospects is one that actually I know a science fiction writer, I think it's Kim Robertson, is working on. And he wrote a very good piece, I think, in the New York Review of Books just a week or two ago about what climate change probably entails for society. And as interestingly enough, I first realised the dangers of the West Antarctic ice shelf reading a science fiction book about Mars by Kim Robinson. And in that book, he hypothesized that there had been a sudden collapse in the West Antarctic ice shelf, leading to an environmental catastrophe on Earth, which meant that they then decided they had to invade the nascent colony of humans on Mars. And there's a long sci-fi story on the other end of that. And I remember reading it. This is back in the early 1990s, if not before that. And my reaction was, sci-fi writers rarely use a hook like that unless there's some actual basis to it. So I went looking at what's the story about the West Antarctic ice shelf, and there, sure enough, it's incredibly fragile. Well, the point that Robinson used in his article in the New York Times last week was that there would be a heat crisis in a third world country where the global temperature had risen sufficiently that what's called the wet bulb temperature would exceed 35 degrees, and people are only hanging on in some major economy or some major metropolis somewhere because of air conditioning, and then the power system broke down. And then what that means is within 6 hours, everybody who's exposed to that temperature will die. And you then have the political consequences of that. Amusingly enough, guess what happened in our house yesterday?
Your air conditioning broke down?
No, the entire town's electricity system broke down. It lasted 2 hours, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it wasn't too bad. But this is quite likely to happen. We are likely to see something of that nature happen, where it was the temperature level rises, suddenly the power system gets stressed, and a city which is only barely hanging on because everybody's in air conditioning breaks down, and then bang, you have those people dying en masse. And then what's the reaction of their government? Well, if the government has nuclear weapons, such as India or Pakistan, it could be a very interesting reaction. So
well, let's hope we don't get to that stage. Look, I mean, just back to where we are now. Just finally, a quick question from Cloudy in Spain, one of our listeners. He says in 2008, I think we've sort of answered it today. In 2008, the world came out with Keynesian stimulus, but in Europe we saw austerity. Central banks and governments have acted quickly this time, but do you see it that possible that ideology, narratives, and intellectual animal spirits can cause mistakes like 10 years ago? Well, I think different mistakes is the answer to that, isn't it?
Basically, different mistakes, yeah. I mean, again, we're likely to get the siren call for austerity to pay back the government debt. We're likely to, there'll be resistance to the idea of a jubilee, which is the only thing which could actually save the whole system. Of course, we'd need a rescue for people in the financial sector to get them over the shock of going from £750,000 in income to a mere 75,000. And I'm using an actual example there, by the way. I think they'll resist that hand tooth and claw, and then we'll find ourselves walking into a climate catastrophe regardless and have to cope with that. So they'll make the wrong decisions.
What I find strange is even in the mainstream media, it seems like an obvious question for a switched-on journalist. I know there's not many of them around, but to ask, if everyone is getting into debt, if every government around the world is getting into debt to pay for this thing, and every company and every individual is getting more and more into debt, wouldn't the obvious question be, well, if we're all in debt, can't we just write it off and start again?
Well,
why is that question never? To which the answer would be from a banker. Well, somebody is making money from that debt. Are you saying that person shouldn't be earning the money from offering that debt?
Well, that's the danger in people's conventional thinking about this. I saw this being mentioned by some Twitterite today, saying that because one asset is somebody else's liability, you can't have a debt write-off. It'll destroy the other side. That's still thinking in a loanable fund sense. Where if you've lent me the money and you don't repay me, then I suffer. And, I have personal experience of that sort of situation.
Yeah. But that is fine as an argument for an individual loaning to another individual, but it doesn't apply to a central bank.
But when a bank loans to a non-bank, it's a very different story. Because you create money by lending, you destroy money by repaying it. A debt jubilee would neither create nor destroy money. It would simply change the basis of the money from being credit-based to being fiat-based. The real impact, as you said at the beginning, is on the finance sector, because it would lose, up to 3/4 of its resources, which currently earn it income in terms of loans, would be replaced by cash reserves from which they make no money. Now, that would actually put them in a desperate situation of needing, if in terms of their asset backing, they can't lend from the reserves, as I've mentioned numerous times, but they would have a desperate need to go from non-income earning assets to income earning assets. So there would be an inspiration for the banks to start lending. And if they couldn't lend to property speculators and they couldn't lend to share market speculators, both of which I'd attempt to ban, then they'd have to lend to corporations and individuals, and we might get a bit of an entrepreneurial boost to the economy, which
we need, because we're going to see this massive structural shift, and companies will disappear and new industries hopefully will emerge, or new companies will replace the companies that have gone to the wall. So absolutely, we need banks to help see through those investments. Very interesting stuff. Good to talk as always, Steve. Let's see what happens in the next week or two. I mean, I was going to say in the next year or two. But it's the next week or two, isn't it?
It moves pretty rapidly. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Talk soon. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
And next time, not entirely related to COVID-19, but it is related a bit. We're going to look at income disparity. Obviously, we are going to see a widening of the income gap as a result of the haves and have-nots, the have a job and don't have a jobs, who've been through this whole thing. But generally, what does income disparity mean for productivity? What does it mean for the ability for a country to grow? We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. For that one, you do need to be a subscriber. This podcast was free, available to everybody. If you want to listen to all the podcasts, and we've done over 200 of them now, then you do need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com, or go to Patreon and support Steve Keen there, patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you next time. Thanks for listening.